Hello. I'm very pleased to be able to address the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. This is a critical time in global history, and the issues that you are addressing are important to all of our countries. I should begin by saying that I'm very happy that Joe Biden was elected as the 46th President of the United States. The past 4 years have been very turbulent and very bad for the Atlantic community. And I think that under this new presidency, the United States will return to its traditional commitments to Atlantic solidarity. This morning, I want to talk about two issues. First is the geopolitical context in which we are living, and the second has to do with the role of IT specifically and the large IT platforms. So let's begin with the changing international context. There has been a return of great power competition and a global democratic recession, which at this point in 2021 has now been going on for the last 15 years. On the one hand, you see the rise of consolidated authoritarian powers, primarily Russia and China. They present different kinds of challenges to the Western world. In the case of Russia, they have a relatively weak political base and economic base, but they're willing to take large risks, and they're also willing to be very creative in their use of new instruments of power. Peter Pomerantsev has written about how the nature of Russian propaganda has changed from Soviet times. It used to be that they would promote their own system. They're not interested in doing that any longer. What they want to do is sow doubt in the minds of democratic publics about the legitimacy of their own political systems. China has been a little bit later to this cyber weaponization, but they've learned very quickly, and they're now doing some of the same things that Russia is, but with a much larger resource base. And I think we can expect to see China insert itself into democratic politics to a much larger degree. The other major change in the geopolitical environment is the rise of populism that was first marked by the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and by the British vote to leave the European Union. Populism has a lot of roots. Part of it is economic, from the inequalities created by globalization that has left behind working class populations in many rich countries. But it has taken on a cultural dimension in which the resentment of ordinary people against the kinds of elites that have been governing many democracies has evolved into a form of tribalism. In the United States, we have a particularly severe case of this, where identity has become the major dividing line between so-called red and blue sides of this division. And in fact, where loyalty to a single individual, former President Trump, has become the hallmark of what it means to be a Republican, and not ideology, not policy issues. It's a pure form of personalistic politics. The two sides of this democratic decline, the rise of great powers and the internal divisions within democratic countries, are related to each other because it is those divisions that the other great powers, the authoritarian great powers, can exploit, and both of them have been very good at doing that. Now, let me turn to the role of information technology, and particularly to the role of the large platforms and what their impact on democratic politics has been. And by the way, when I talk about the internet platforms, I'm really just talking about three companies. I'm talking about Twitter, Facebook, and Google. The challenge that they present is directly related to their scale. I think we need to begin by noting that they are not responsible for the existence of fake news and conspiracy theories. These theories have always existed. They exist in the society, and actually their expression is protected by our provisions in modern democracies for freedom of speech. I don't think the objective of policy should ever be to simply eliminate the ability of people to believe even in the most crazy kinds of conspiracy theories. The problem that is posed by the platforms is directly related to their scale. They are so dominant that they resemble, in the United States, the three large television networks that controlled political discourse back in the 1950s and 60s. And the real threat that they pose is not that they carry fake news or conspiracy theories, but rather that they have a great power of either amplifying or silencing certain voices. This power, I think, has been on display most recently with Twitter's ban on Donald Trump that began after the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. It's been remarkable the degree to which the US president could be silenced by a decision by a single private company and the executives that control it. And it illustrates the degree to which these companies have become politically extremely powerful. So I think that the problem that they present, first of all, there are economic aspects to this in terms of their ability to exclude competition. But that's not the issue that I think we need to worry about in the security community. It really has to do more with their influence over democratic politics. At the moment, we may approve some of the short-term decisions that these companies have taken to take down material that is right-wing, inflammatory, encouraging violence. But in the long run, I do not think that this is an adequate approach for a liberal democracy to take. It's not sustainable to simply rely on the good decisions of a private party that has no democratic accountability. There is no legitimacy to a large private company taking decisions that are this politically important. I think that a number of alternative methods have been suggested for reducing the underlying power of these companies, and I think that all of these need to be pursued. These would include, for example, antitrust actions. These have already been undertaken, first by the European Union, but now by the US Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission, as well as a coalition of state attorney generals. You can have regulation. This is something that is much more possible in Europe with a longer history of efforts to regulate the private sector than in the United States. There's the idea of data portability, which is intended to enable greater competition among platforms. And finally, there is privacy law, like Europe's GDPR, that in theory should prevent a large platform from moving data generated in one area and using it to achieve dominance in another area. I think that all of these ideas are important. They need to be explored. But ultimately, I don't think that any of them will be sufficient to address the central political threat that I think the platforms present, which is this ability to either amplify or silence particular political voices. They may solve other problems like the missing economic competition in that sphere, but they don't address the threat to democracy itself. My group at Stanford, the Working Group on Platform Scale, has made a suggestion for how to deal with this issue, which we label middleware. This would involve the creation of a competitive layer of companies to which the big internet platforms could outsource content curation. The problem that they pose right now is that the feeds that you get on one of the platforms is really determined by the companies themselves through non-transparent algorithms that are meant to serve the company's bottom line and not the needs of a democratic public. They're completely non-transparent. They're developed by AI programs. And I think what we would want to see is their replacement by user control. And the easiest way to do this at the present moment is to outsource them to middleware companies that could take those feeds and tailor them for reliability, for product choice, for political preference, but in ways that would be determined by the users themselves and not by these large corporations. It's not clear whether this will solve the problem. There are many issues that would have to be worked out, like their business model or the regulatory regime that would be required to create this. But I think it's important on a global level. Facebook, for example, has been hugely important in supporting authoritarian policies in countries like India or Myanmar or the Philippines. And that company on its own does not have the capacity to make good political choices as to what is acceptable content. And I think this proposal is something that could be adopted internationally by other countries, in which, for example, NGOs or nonprofit groups could be the filters that would provide reliable information to local publics. So, this is my view of the current challenges we face. I wish I could participate directly in your conference, but I wish you luck, and I hope that your discussions will lead to practical solutions that can be implemented by members of our Atlantic community. Thank you very much for your attention.